What do you do when your hotel's front desk calls to tell you your wife just checked in with another man, and you own every room, every camera, and the security feed that's about to show you your marriage ending in real time while she pays for betrayal with your own credit card? My name is Nathan Cross, and I have spent the last 15 years of my life building a small empire of boutique hotels in the kinds of neighborhoods where people go to escape their ordinary lives for a weekend, which means I have become an expert in understanding the geography of secrets and the architecture of places where people believe they can be someone other than who they are in their daylight existence. I own 4 properties across the city, each one carefully designed to offer the kind of discreet luxury that attracts guests who value privacy and are willing to pay premium rates for the assurance that their business will remain their own. And over the years, I have learned to read the subtle signs that distinguish a genuine traveler from someone who is using my hotel as a stage set for a performance they cannot put on anywhere else in their life. The call came at 2:47 on a Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in my office at the flagship property reviewing the quarterly financial reports and trying to decide whether to invest in renovating the penthouse suites or putting that capital toward acquiring a 5th location that had recently come on the market. My front desk manager, Patricia, had been with me since I opened the first hotel 9 years ago, and she was not the kind of person who called me during business hours unless there was a genuine emergency that required my immediate attention. So when I saw her name on my phone screen, I felt a small spike of adrenaline that told me something significant had happened that could not wait until our usual end-of-day briefing. I answered the call, and Patricia's voice came through with a quality of careful restraint that told me she was choosing her words with unusual precision. And she said that she needed to inform me that my wife had just checked into the hotel and that she was not alone. I felt the words land in my mind like stones dropping into still water, and for a moment I could not process what Patricia was telling me because the idea that my wife Emma would check into one of my own hotels with another man seemed so improbable that I wondered if Patricia had somehow misidentified the guest or had confused my wife with someone who merely resembled her. I asked Patricia if she was certain it was Emma, and Patricia told me in the same carefully measured tone that yes, she was absolutely certain because she had checked Emma in personally and had verified her identity through the credit card she had used to secure the room, which turned out to be the joint card that Emma and I shared for household expenses, and that was linked to my primary checking account. Patricia said that Emma had booked a suite on the 4th floor and had arrived with a man that Patricia did not recognize, and that they had gone directly to the elevators without stopping in the lobby or the bar, which suggested that they wanted to minimize their visibility to other guests and staff. I thanked Patricia for calling me and told her that I would handle the situation personally, and then I ended the call and sat in my office chair staring at the financial reports on my desk without seeing them, because my mind was occupied with the task of trying to reconcile what Patricia had just told me with everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my wife's character and her patterns of behavior over the 12 years we had been together. Emma had never given me any reason to suspect that she was unhappy or dissatisfied with our relationship, and while I would acknowledge that we had fallen into certain comfortable routines that perhaps lacked the intensity and excitement of our early years together, I had always believed that we had built something stable and trustworthy that would endure whatever challenges life presented to us. The idea that Emma would not only have an affair but would conduct that affair in one of my own hotels using my own credit card seemed like such a profound miscalculation of risk and consequence that I found myself wondering whether this was some kind of deliberate provocation designed to force a confrontation that Emma had been too afraid to initiate through normal conversation. I opened my laptop and logged into the hotel's property management system using my owner credentials, and I pulled up the reservation that Patricia had mentioned and confirmed that yes, Emma had booked a junior suite on the 4th floor for a single night and had used our joint credit card to guarantee the room, and the reservation had been made only 3 hours earlier, which suggested that this had been a spontaneous decision rather than something that had been planned days or weeks in advance. I noted the room number, and then I opened a different system that gave me access to the hotel's security camera feeds, which was something I had installed several years ago as a standard security measure after a guest had filed a false injury claim that we were only able to disprove because we had video evidence showing that the alleged incident had never occurred. I knew that accessing security footage of my own wife without her knowledge was ethically questionable at best and potentially illegal depending on how a court might interpret privacy laws, but I also knew that I was the legal owner of the property and that the security system existed precisely to protect my interests and my investment, and I told myself that I had a right to know what was happening under my own roof even if what I discovered would be painful and difficult to process. I navigated through the camera system until I found the feed from the 4th floor hallway, and I scrolled back through the timeline until I reached the moment when Emma and her companion had arrived at the suite, and I watched on my computer screen as my wife of 12 years walked down the corridor with a man I had never seen before, a man who was perhaps 10 years younger than me and who carried himself with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had to build something from nothing or fight for recognition in a world that does not hand out success to people who merely show up and smile. I watched as Emma used the key card to open the door to the suite, and I watched as the man placed his hand on the small of her back in a gesture that was simultaneously casual and proprietary, and then they disappeared into the room, and the hallway was empty again, except for the ambient light from the sconces and the faint hum of the ventilation system. I sat staring at the frozen image on my screen for several minutes, trying to understand what I was feeling, and what I discovered was that I was not experiencing the explosive anger or the crushing heartbreak that I had always imagined would accompany the discovery of a spouse's infidelity, but rather a kind of cold analytical clarity, though that allowed me to observe the situation as if I were reviewing a business problem that required a strategic solution rather than an emotional response. I realized that this detachment was probably a defense mechanism that would eventually give way to more intense feelings once the initial shock wore off, but in that moment I was grateful for it because it allowed me to think clearly about what I needed to do next and how I could gather the information I needed to make informed decisions about the future of my marriage and my financial interests. I pulled up the billing history for the joint credit card and searched for any previous charges from my hotels. And what I found was a pattern that I had somehow failed to notice during my routine reviews of our monthly statements because I had been looking at the charges in aggregate rather than examining individual line items with a suspicious eye. Over the past 4 months, Emma had booked rooms at my hotels on 3 separate occasions, each time using the same junior suite layout on the 4th floor, and each time the reservation had been made for a Thursday afternoon checkout the following morning, which corresponded exactly with the days when Emma had told me she was attending volunteer committee meetings for the charity gala she had been helping to organize. I felt a sick recognition settle in my stomach as I understood that Emma had been conducting her affair literally on my property and charging it to my credit card, and that she had been doing so with enough regularity to establish a pattern that I should have caught if I had been paying attention to the details, instead of trusting that my wife would never do something so brazenly reckless. I opened a new spreadsheet and began documenting everything I had discovered, creating a timeline that showed each hotel reservation alongside Emma's stated alibis for those same dates, and I made sure to include screenshots of the credit card charges and the property management system records that showed Emma's name as the registered guest for each reservation. I also made a note of the security camera footage and the timestamp when Emma and her companion had entered the suite, and I saved all of this information in a password-protected folder that only I could access because I had learned from years of running a business that documentation was the foundation of any successful negotiation or legal proceeding, and I suspected that I was going to need every piece of evidence I could gather if the situation evolved into a contested divorce or a dispute over asset division. The question that occupied my mind as I compiled this evidence was not whether Emma was having an affair, because the proof of that was now irrefutable and documented in multiple independent sources, but rather who the man was and how Emma had met him, and whether this relationship represented a genuine emotional connection that might justify the destruction of our marriage, or whether it was simply a symptom of some midlife crisis or temporary dissatisfaction that Emma had chosen to address through infidelity rather than through honest conversation with her husband. I thought about calling Emma's phone and confronting her immediately, but I realized that doing so would only give her an opportunity to construct a narrative or destroy evidence or coordinate a story with her lover, and that the strategic advantage I currently held was the fact that Emma had no idea I knew what she was doing or that I had access to detailed records of her activities in my own hotel. I decided that before I confronted Emma, I needed to identify the man she was with, and the most efficient way to do that was to have Patricia pull up the reservation details and see if Emma had listed a second guest name or if there were any other records that might reveal his identity. I called Patricia back and asked her to send me any information she had about the reservation, including whether Emma had mentioned who would be accompanying her or whether she had requested any special amenities or services that might provide clues about the nature of her visit. Patricia told me that Emma had not listed a second guest name, but that she had requested champagne and strawberries be sent to the room, which was one of the romantic packages we offered for couples celebrating special occasions. And Patricia said that she had recognized the man with Emma as someone who had been at the hotel several times over the past few months, usually in connection with events or meetings in our conference spaces. I asked Patricia if she could identify the man from our event records, and after a brief pause, she told me that she believed he was Julian Vance, who worked as an event coordinator for the charity organization that had been using our ballroom for planning meetings related to the upcoming gala that was scheduled to take place in 3 weeks. I felt another piece of the puzzle click into place as I understood that Emma had met this man through her volunteer work organizing the charity event, and that their affair had apparently begun during the planning process when they had been working together on logistics and vendor coordination and all the other details that go into producing a successful fundraiser. I thanked Patricia again and told her to continue managing the hotel as normal and not to let anyone know that I was aware of the situation. And then I ended the call and sat alone in my office, contemplating the cruel irony that my wife had found her lover, while organizing an event that was supposed to celebrate community values and charitable giving and all the other noble principles that people invoke when they want to feel good about themselves while ignoring the damage they cause in their private lives. I spent the next hour sitting in my office, conducting research on Julian Vance using the various digital tools and professional networks that are available to anyone who knows where to look for information about people who maintain public profiles connected to their work and their social activities. What I discovered was that Julian was 32 years old, which made him 7 years younger than me and 9 years younger than Emma, and that he had been working in event coordination and hospitality services for approximately 6 years after graduating from a mid-tier university with a degree in communications and marketing. His professional profile suggested that he specialized in nonprofit fundraising events and corporate gatherings, and he appeared to have built a modest reputation within the local charity circuit as someone who could execute elegant events on reasonable budgets, which presumably was how he had come to the attention of the organization that Emma had been volunteering with for the past 8 months. I also discovered through a simple search of public records and social media profiles that Julian was married, which added another layer of complication and potential leverage to the situation, because it meant that he had just as much to lose from public exposure of the affair as Emma did, and possibly more if his professional reputation depended on maintaining an image of trustworthiness and discretion with the nonprofit organizations that hired him for their events. His wife appeared to be named Claire Vance, and from what I could determine through her social media presence, she worked as a program director for the same charity organization that was hosting the gala, which meant that she was likely Julian's direct supervisor, or at minimum, someone who had significant influence over his continued employment and his access to future contracts. I found myself wondering whether Claire had any suspicion about her husband's affair with Emma, or whether she was as ignorant of the situation as I had been until Patricia's phone call had forced me to confront a reality that had apparently been unfolding literally under my nose for months. The more I learned about Julian and his professional circumstances, the more I began to see the outline of a strategy that would allow me to address the situation in a way that maximized my leverage while minimizing the risk of Emma simply denying everything or claiming that I was being paranoid or controlling. I realized that the key to any successful confrontation would be to present evidence that was so comprehensive and so irrefutable that Emma would have no choice but to acknowledge what she had done, and that the most effective way to gather that evidence would be to document not just this single hotel visit, but the entire pattern of her affair over the past 4 months, including the dates and times and financial transactions that proved she had been systematically lying to me about her whereabouts while using my own resources to facilitate her betrayal. I returned to the hotel's property management system and began pulling detailed records for each of the 3 previous reservations that Emma had made, and I made sure to capture screenshots of every relevant data point, including the check-in and check-out times, the room rates that had been charged to our joint credit card, and any additional services or amenities that Emma had requested during those stays. I also went back through the security camera archives for each of those dates, and I was able to confirm that on all 3 previous occasions Emma had arrived at the hotel with the same man who I now knew to be Julian Vance, and that their pattern of behavior had been consistent across all visits, with both of them entering the hotel discreetly and proceeding directly to the 4th-floor suite without lingering in any of the public spaces where they might be recognized by other guests or staff members. What struck me as I reviewed this accumulated evidence was not just the fact of Emma's infidelity, but the calculated nature of her deception, because each hotel visit had been carefully timed to coincide with charity committee meetings that Emma had told me were essential to the success of the gala, and that required her full attention for entire afternoons and evenings. I remembered how Emma had emphasized to me on multiple occasions that these meetings were mandatory and that she could not miss them without jeopardizing her standing with the organization and her ability to contribute meaningfully to the event. And I remembered how guilty I had felt on the occasions when I had suggested that maybe she was overcommitting herself and should consider scaling back her volunteer responsibilities to preserve time for our relationship and her own well-being. I realize now that Emma had been using my own considerate nature and my respect for her charitable work as a weapon against me, counting on the fact that I would never question her dedication to a good cause or demand proof that she was actually attending the meetings she claimed were so important to her. I decided that, before I confronted Emma directly, I needed to verify one additional piece of information, which was whether the charity organization had actually been holding committee meetings on the dates when Emma had claimed to be attending them, because if I could prove that those meetings had never existed, then I would have irrefutable evidence that Emma's alibis were fabricated and that her hotel visits with Julian had nothing to do with legitimate volunteer work. I found the contact information for the charity's main office on their website, and I called their general line and asked to speak with someone who could provide me with information about the Gala Planning Committee's meeting schedule. The woman who answered the phone transferred me to an administrative assistant named Beth, and I explained to Beth that my wife, Emma Cross, had been volunteering with the Gala Committee and that I was trying to verify the dates of certain meetings for personal scheduling purposes. Beth was friendly and helpful in the way that nonprofit staff members tend to be when they are speaking with the spouse of a volunteer donor, and she told me that she would be happy to check the committee meeting calendar and provide me with the information I needed. After a brief hold, she came back on the line and told me that the Gala Planning Committee had been meeting every other Tuesday evening at the charity's office building, and that there had not been any Thursday meetings scheduled during the time period I was asking about because most of the committee members had other professional obligations on Thursday afternoons. I felt a cold wave of confirmation wash over me as I understood that Emma's Thursday afternoon alibis had been complete fabrications, and that every time she had told me she was attending a critical committee meeting, she had actually been checking into my hotel with Julian Vance for what I could only assume were extended afternoon encounters that Emma had somehow convinced herself she could conduct indefinitely without consequences or discovery. I thanked Beth for her help and ended the call, and then I added this information to my growing evidence file along with a note documenting the date and time of my conversation and the specific details that Beth had provided about the committee's actual meeting schedule. I now had what any reasonable person would consider overwhelming proof of Emma's affair, including credit card records, hotel reservation records, security camera footage, witness identification from my front desk manager, and direct contradiction of Emma's stated alibis through verification with the organization she claimed to be volunteering for. The question that remained was not whether I had enough evidence to confront Emma, but rather how and when I should initiate that confrontation in a way that would maximize my strategic advantage and minimize Emma's ability to deflect or reframe the situation in her favor. I thought about the various options available to me, ranging from an immediate private confrontation in our home to a more calculated public exposure that would force Emma and Julian to face social and professional consequences for their actions. I thought about my therapist's advice from years ago when I had been dealing with a difficult business partner who had been systematically undermining our company, and I remembered how she had told me that the most effective way to handle betrayal was to remove emotion from the equation and treat the situation as a problem that required a strategic solution rather than a personal vendetta that required emotional satisfaction. I had followed that advice with my business partner and had ultimately been able to force him out of the company with a settlement agreement that protected my interests while avoiding a costly and public legal battle, and I wondered whether I could apply the same principles to my current situation with Emma. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the upcoming charity gala represented a unique opportunity to address the situation in a way that would have maximum impact, while also serving a form of poetic justice, because the gala was the very event that had brought Emma and Julian together and had provided them with the cover story they needed to conduct their affair without arousing suspicion. I knew that the gala was scheduled to take place in my hotel's ballroom in 3 weeks, and I knew that both Emma and Julian would be expected to attend as key members of the planning committee, and I knew that Claire Vance would also be present in her capacity as the charity's program director and Julian's direct supervisor. I began to see the outline of a plan that would allow me to expose the affair in a context where all the relevant parties would be present and where the social and professional consequences would be immediate and unavoidable. I spent the remainder of that afternoon and evening documenting every aspect of Emma's affair that I could verify through records and footage and witness statements, and I organized all of this information into a comprehensive file that told a clear and chronological story of deception that had begun 4 months ago and that had continued with disturbing regularity every other week when Emma had claimed to be attending committee meetings that had never existed. I made sure that every piece of evidence was dated and sourced and that I had multiple independent confirmations for each significant fact, because I knew from my business experience that the strength of any case depends not on the volume of evidence, but on the quality and reliability of that evidence and the degree to which it can withstand scrutiny and challenge. When Emma came home that evening at around 7 o'clock, she was carrying her volunteer committee tote bag and wearing the same pleasant expression she always wore when she returned from what she claimed were productive meetings, and she greeted me with a casual kiss on the cheek and asked how my day had been. I told her that my day had been productive and that I had spent most of it reviewing financial reports and working on strategic planning for the hotels, which was true enough even if it omitted certain significant details about how I had spent my afternoon. Emma told me that her committee meeting had gone well and that they were making excellent progress on the final preparations for the gala. and that she thought the event was going to be one of the most successful fundraisers the organization had ever produced. I listened to her describe the meeting that had never happened and the progress that had never been made, and I felt a strange sense of detachment as I realized that I was watching my wife perform a script that she had apparently rehearsed and refined over the course of 4 months and dozens of lies. I did not confront Emma that evening because I wanted to give myself time to think through my strategy and to make sure that I was approaching the situation with the kind of cold calculation that would serve my interests better than an emotional outburst driven by anger or hurt feelings. I also wanted to gather additional information about Julian's situation and his relationship with his wife Claire, because I suspected that understanding the dynamics of their marriage and their professional relationship would give me insights into how best to expose the affair in a way that would have consequences that extended beyond just my own household. I went to bed that night in the guest room, claiming that I had a headache and needed quiet to rest, and Emma accepted this explanation without question or concern, which told me that she had become so comfortable with her pattern of deception that she no longer felt any anxiety about maintaining her cover story or monitoring my reactions for signs of suspicion. Over the next several days, I maintained a carefully controlled facade of normalcy while I continued to gather information and refine my understanding of the situation I was facing. And I found that the discipline required to act as though nothing had changed in my relationship with Emma was actually less difficult than I had anticipated, because I had spent so many years in business negotiations where the ability to conceal your true intentions and reactions was essential to achieving favorable outcomes. Emma seemed to notice nothing unusual in my behavior, which told me either that she was so absorbed in her affair that she had stopped paying attention to the subtle signals that might indicate her husband's awareness of her betrayal, or that she had become so confident in her ability to maintain her dual life that she believed herself to be essentially immune from discovery. I spent considerable time during those days researching Julian Vance's professional history and his relationship with the charity organization that employed him, and what I discovered was that his position was significantly more precarious than his polished social media presence would suggest. I learned through conversations with vendors and event staff who had worked with him on previous projects that Julian had a reputation for being charming and creative, but also somewhat unreliable when it came to following through on commitments and managing budgets responsibly, and that there had been at least 2 instances in the past year where nonprofit clients had complained to his supervisors about cost overruns and missed deadlines that had nearly derailed important fundraising events. I also learned that Julian's wife Claire had been instrumental in securing his current position with the charity organization despite some internal resistance from board members who questioned whether it was appropriate to hire the spouse of a senior staff member for what was essentially a contractor role that involved significant financial authority and access to donor information. This information was valuable to me because it suggested that Julian's professional survival depended heavily on maintaining his wife's support and protecting his reputation within the relatively small and interconnected world of nonprofit event coordination, and that any public exposure of his affair with a married volunteer would likely result not just in personal embarrassment, but in the immediate termination of his contract and the probable end of his career in a field where trust and discretion were considered essential qualifications. I realized that Julian had taken an enormous risk by conducting an affair with Emma under circumstances where discovery was essentially inevitable given the number of staff members and volunteers who moved through my hotel on a regular basis, and I wondered whether this recklessness was a function of arrogance or stupidity, or perhaps a self-destructive impulse that was driving him to sabotage his own life in ways that he did not fully understand or acknowledge. I also spent time during those days observing Emma more carefully than I had in years, watching for signs of the dissatisfaction or unhappiness that might explain why she had chosen to risk our marriage for an affair with a man who seemed to offer nothing that I had not already provided in terms of financial security or social standing or opportunities for personal growth and fulfillment. What I observed was that Emma seemed genuinely happy and energized in a way that I had not seen since the early years of our marriage, and that she moved through our home and our shared routines with a kind of lightness and enthusiasm that suggested she was experiencing her affair not as a shameful secret that weighed on her conscience, but as an exciting adventure that had injected new vitality into what she presumably found to be an otherwise stagnant and predictable existence. This realization was more painful to me than the fact of the affair itself, because it forced me to confront the possibility that I had somehow failed to provide Emma with whatever emotional or psychological needs had driven her into the arms of another man, and that my focus on building and managing my hotel business had perhaps created a kind of emotional distance that Emma had tried to fill through her volunteer work and had ultimately filled through her relationship with Julian. I found myself reviewing our marriage with the same analytical mindset I brought to business problems, trying to identify the specific moments or decisions or patterns of behavior that had created the conditions for Emma's betrayal. And what I discovered was not any single catastrophic failure, but rather a gradual accumulation of small disconnections and missed opportunities for deeper intimacy that had apparently left Emma feeling unseen or unappreciated in ways that she had never articulated to me directly. I considered the possibility that I should simply confront Emma privately and give her an opportunity to explain herself and to express whatever grievances or dissatisfactions had led to her affair, and that perhaps we could work through the crisis with the help of a marriage counselor and emerge with a stronger relationship built on more honest communication and a clearer understanding of each other's needs. But every time I contemplated this approach, I found myself returning to the evidence file I had compiled, and I found myself focusing on the specific details that revealed not just the fact of Emma's betrayal, but the calculated and systematic nature of her deception, and I realized that what bothered me most was not that Emma had been unfaithful, but that she had been willing to lie to me repeatedly and with apparent ease while using my own resources to facilitate her affair and while maintaining a performance of marital contentment that was so convincing I had never thought to question it. I decided that I needed to understand more about Claire Vance and her relationship with Julian before I finalized my strategy for exposing the affair, because I suspected that Claire's reaction to the news of her husband's infidelity would be a crucial variable in determining how much damage the exposure would cause to both Emma and Julian's personal and professional lives. I used my business connections to arrange a casual introduction to Claire at a nonprofit networking event that I knew she would be attending, and I made sure to present myself simply as a hotel owner who was interested in learning more about the charity sector and potentially supporting worthy causes through venue donations and sponsorships. Claire turned out to be a sharp and articulate woman in her mid-30s who spoke with genuine passion about the organization's mission and who seemed to possess both the strategic intelligence and the organizational skills required to manage complex fundraising operations and coordinate teams of staff and volunteers. During our conversation, I mentioned that my wife Emma had been volunteering with the Gala Planning Committee, and I watched Claire's face carefully for any reaction that might suggest she was aware of the affair between Emma and her husband Julian. But what I saw was only pleasant recognition and sincere appreciation for Emma's contributions to the event planning process. Claire told me that Emma had been one of their most dedicated and effective volunteers, and that she had brought valuable perspective and attention to detail that had helped elevate the quality of the gala far beyond what they had achieved in previous years. And Claire said that she was particularly grateful that Emma had been willing to work so closely with Julian on the logistics and vendor coordination aspects of the event, because Julian could sometimes be disorganized and needed a partner who could keep him focused on deadlines and deliverables. I felt a bitter irony listening to Claire praise the partnership between Emma and Julian, while having no idea that their professional collaboration had evolved into something far more intimate and far more damaging to everyone involved, and I found myself feeling an unexpected sympathy for Claire because it was clear that she trusted both her husband and my wife completely, and had no reason to suspect that their Thursday afternoon meetings were anything other than the legitimate planning sessions they claimed to be. I realized that exposing the affair would hurt Claire as much as it would hurt me, and that she would likely face professional complications, in addition to personal betrayal, because her decision to advocate for Julian's hiring would be called into question once it became known that he had violated basic standards of professional conduct by pursuing a romantic relationship with a married volunteer who was effectively under his supervision in the context of the gala planning work. After my conversation with Claire, I spent several more days refining my plan and making sure that I had considered all the possible variables and outcomes that might result from a public exposure of the affair at the charity gala. I decided that the most effective approach would be to prepare a simple one-page document that laid out the basic facts of Emma and Julian's affair in chronological order, supported by key pieces of evidence including credit card receipts showing the hotel charges, reservation records showing Emma's name as the registered guest, and security camera timestamps showing both Emma and Julian entering the hotel together on multiple occasions. I made sure that the document was factual and clinical in tone, with no emotional language or personal attacks, because I wanted the evidence to speak for itself, and I wanted to avoid giving Emma or Julian any opportunity to claim that I was motivated by vindictiveness or that I was presenting a biased or distorted version of events. I also decided that I would not distribute this document widely or post it publicly in any way that might constitute harassment or defamation, but rather that I would provide copies to a very select group of individuals who had a legitimate professional or personal interest in knowing about the affair and who were in positions to make decisions about the consequences that Emma and Julian would face. This group would include Claire Vance as Julian's wife and supervisor, the executive director of the charity organization as the person ultimately responsible for vendor conduct and volunteer management, and Emma's parents and sister as the family members who had repeatedly told me over the years that I was lucky to have married such a trustworthy and devoted partner. I knew that by limiting the distribution of the evidence in this way, I was ensuring that the information would spread through organic social networks rather than through any action that could be traced directly back to me, and that the consequences for Emma and Julian would be the natural result of their own choices rather than anything that could be characterized as revenge or retaliation on my part. On the Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week before the charity gala was scheduled to take place, Emma came home from what she claimed was a committee meeting at the charity's office and told me with obvious excitement that the final preparations were complete and that she was confident the event would exceed all fundraising goals and would establish a new standard for excellence in the organization's annual gala series. She told me that she had been working particularly closely with Julian Vance to finalize the vendor contracts and the timeline for the evening's program, and that she had developed tremendous respect for his professionalism and his creative vision for how to make the event both elegant and emotionally impactful for the donors and supporters who would be attending. I listened to Emma praise the man she had been sleeping with in my hotel room for the past 4 months, and I felt a kind of cold clarity settle over me as I understood that Emma had become so comfortable with her deception that she no longer felt any need to be careful about how she spoke about Julian in my presence. I told Emma that I was looking forward to attending the gala and supporting the cause, and that I was proud of all the work she had put into making the event successful. Emma smiled and told me that it meant a lot to her, that I was supportive of her volunteer work, even though it had required her to spend so many evenings away from home over the past several months, and she said that she felt like the experience had given her a sense of purpose and accomplishment that she had been missing in her life. I nodded and told her that I understood the importance of having meaningful work outside the home, and that I was glad she had found an outlet for her talents and her desire to contribute to something larger than herself. The week leading up to the charity gala passed with excruciating slowness as I went through the motions of my normal work routine while simultaneously finalizing the details of my plan to expose Emma and Julian's affair in a way that would maximize the impact while minimizing any potential legal liability or claims that I had acted improperly or vindictively. I spent hours consulting with my attorney Richard, whom I had known for years through various business transactions and property acquisitions, and I explained to him in careful detail what I had discovered about Emma's affair and what evidence I had compiled, and what my intentions were regarding the distribution of that evidence to a limited group of individuals who had legitimate reasons to know about the situation. Richard listened without interrupting and then told me that from a legal standpoint I was on solid ground as long as I stuck to verifiable facts supported by documentation and as long as I limited my communications to people who had direct personal or professional relationships with the parties involved. Richard also advised me to prepare for the possibility that Emma might respond to the exposure by filing for divorce and seeking a favorable settlement based on claims that I had violated her privacy or had created a hostile environment through surveillance, and he recommended that I document my own version of events in a detailed memorandum that would establish the timeline of my discovery and the reasonable steps I had taken to verify the affair before taking any action. I followed Richard's advice and spent an entire evening writing out a comprehensive narrative that explained how I had first learned about Emma's hotel visit through my front desk manager's call, how I had subsequently discovered the pattern of previous visits through my review of credit card records and hotel reservation systems, and how I had verified that Emma's claimed alibis were false through my conversation with the charity organization's administrative staff. I made sure to emphasize in my narrative that I had not engaged in any illegal surveillance or hacking of Emma's private communications, but had simply reviewed records and footage from my own business property that I had every legal right to access as the owner. During that same week, I also made arrangements to ensure that the charity gala would proceed as planned despite the disruption that I knew would result from my exposure of the affair, because I did not want the legitimate fundraising goals of the organization to be compromised by the personal failures of two individuals who had chosen to conduct their relationship in a way that violated both professional ethics and personal commitments. I contacted the charity's executive director, Margaret Chen, through a formal written communication and informed her that I would be providing her with information on the evening of the gala that would require her immediate attention and that might necessitate changes to the event program, but that I wanted to assure her that my hotel would fulfill all of its contractual obligations and would provide any additional support needed to ensure the evening was successful, despite whatever complications might arise. Margaret responded with a polite but puzzled message thanking me for my commitment to the event and asking if there was anything she should know in advance, but I told her only that the information was sensitive and time-dependent and that it would be more appropriate to discuss it in person on the evening of the gala. I also made sure during that week to maintain my usual patterns of behavior around Emma so that she would have no warning that anything had changed or that I had any knowledge of her affair, and I found that this performance of normalcy was actually easier to sustain as the gala approached, because Emma herself was so preoccupied with last-minute details and logistics that she barely seemed to notice my presence at all. She spent long hours on the phone coordinating with vendors and volunteers, and she made several additional trips to the hotel to review the ballroom setup and verify that all the technical requirements for the evening's program were being properly addressed. On one of these visits, I watched from my office through the security camera system as Emma walked through the ballroom with Julian at her side, and I observed the easy familiarity and casual physical proximity between them that would have been unremarkable to anyone who did not know that they were lovers rather than simply professional colleagues working together on a complex project. The night before the gala, Emma came home late after what she said was a final walkthrough and dress rehearsal for the event program, and she was visibly exhausted but also energized by the anticipation of the following evening, when all of her months of planning and coordination would finally come together in front of an audience of donors and community leaders. She told me that she had laid out the dress she planned to wear on the back of our bedroom door, and that she hoped I would approve of her choice because she had selected something elegant but not too formal that she thought would strike the right balance between respecting the seriousness of the charitable cause and creating a festive atmosphere that would encourage generous giving. I told Emma that I was sure she would look beautiful and that I was proud of everything she had accomplished through her volunteer work, and I watched as she smiled at me with what appeared to be genuine warmth and affection, apparently untroubled by any guilt or anxiety about the double life she had been leading for the past 4 months. On the morning of the gala, I woke early and spent several hours in my home office reviewing the evidence packets I had prepared and making sure that every document was properly labeled and organized for maximum clarity and impact. I had decided to print 5 copies of the complete packet, each one contained in a simple manila folder with a cover sheet that identified the contents as documentation of a professional ethics violation involving volunteer conduct and contractor relationships. One packet would go to Claire Vance before the event began, delivered to her personally by Patricia from my front desk staff, who had agreed to serve as my messenger and who understood the sensitivity and importance of ensuring that Claire received the information in a private setting where she could process the initial shock without public scrutiny. One packet would go to Margaret Chen, the executive director, which I would deliver personally at the moment I judged most appropriate during the evening. One packet would go to Emma's parents, which I would mail to them the morning after the gala so that they would receive it before Emma had an opportunity to construct an alternative narrative about what had happened and why. One packet would remain in my possession as a backup in case any questions arose about the accuracy or authenticity of the evidence. And one packet would be given to Emma herself, which I planned to present to her after the gala was over and after she had been forced to confront the consequences of her choices in front of the community of people she had been trying to impress with her dedication and volunteer service. I arrived at the hotel 3 hours before the gala was scheduled to begin, and I met with Patricia in my office to review the plan for delivering Claire's evidence packet, and to make sure that she understood the importance of giving Claire sufficient time and privacy to review the contents before the event started. Patricia told me that she had already identified a quiet corner of the hotel's business center where she could meet with Claire under the pretense of discussing some administrative details about the event setup, and that she would make sure Claire had at least 30 minutes alone with the packet before she needed to make any decisions about how to proceed. I thanked Patricia for her discretion and her professionalism, and I told her that I understood this was an uncomfortable situation, but that I believed exposing the affair was necessary, both to protect my own interests and to ensure that the charity organization had accurate information about the conduct of one of its contractors. As guests began arriving for the gala, I positioned myself in the ballroom where I could observe the room without being too conspicuous, and I watched as Emma moved through the crowd greeting donors and volunteers and accepting compliments on the elegant decorations and the carefully planned program that would unfold over the course of the evening. She was wearing the dress she had shown me the night before, a midnight blue gown that was simultaneously sophisticated and understated, and I could see from the way she carried herself that she was experiencing the kind of social validation and recognition that had apparently been missing from her life and that had made her vulnerable to Julian's attention and flattery. I also observed Julian working the room in his capacity as the event coordinator, and I noticed the way he and Emma exchanged quick glances and subtle smiles that would have meant nothing to a casual observer, but that I now understood were the private language of two people who believed they were successfully maintaining a secret that no one else had discovered. About 40 minutes before the formal program was scheduled to begin, I saw Patricia enter the ballroom and approach Claire Vance, and I watched as Patricia spoke briefly with Claire and then gestured toward the hallway leading to the business center. Claire followed Patricia out of the ballroom with an expression of mild curiosity but no apparent concern, and I knew that within the next few minutes Claire would be opening the evidence packet and learning that her husband had been conducting an affair with one of the charity's married volunteers using hotel rooms that had been paid for with the volunteer's shared credit card. I felt a momentary pang of regret about the pain I was about to cause Claire, who by all accounts was a dedicated professional who had done nothing to deserve the humiliation and betrayal she was about to experience. But I reminded myself that I was not the one who had created this situation, and that Claire had a right to know the truth about her husband's conduct, just as I had a right to know the truth about my wife's behavior. I remained in the ballroom making small talk with various guests and donors, while keeping one eye on the entrance where I expected Claire to reappear at any moment, and I tried to prepare myself mentally for whatever reaction she might have, and whatever decisions she might make about whether to confront Julian immediately or to wait until after the event was over. What I did not expect was that Claire would appear in the ballroom entrance less than 15 minutes after she had left with Patricia, and that her face would be completely composed and professional, despite what must have been the emotional devastation she was experiencing after reading the evidence of her husband's infidelity. Claire walked directly across the ballroom to where Margaret Chen was standing near the stage area, and I watched as Claire pulled Margaret aside and spoke to her intently for several minutes while showing her what I assumed was the evidence packet, or at least selected pages from it. Margaret's expression changed from pleasant attentiveness to serious concern as she reviewed whatever Claire was showing her, and then both women looked across the room to where Julian was standing near the bar area chatting with a group of donors. I saw Margaret say something to Claire, and then both women began walking purposefully toward Julian with expressions that made it clear this was not a social interaction, but rather a professional intervention that was about to take place in front of approximately 200 guests and donors who had come to the hotel expecting an evening of charitable celebration and elegant entertainment. I felt my pulse quicken as I realized that Claire had decided not to wait until after the event to address the situation, and that the confrontation I had been anticipating as a private matter that would unfold behind closed doors was instead about to become a very public spectacle that would force Emma to face immediate consequences in front of the entire community she had been trying to impress. Julian saw Claire and Margaret approaching, and his smile faltered as he apparently recognized from their expressions that something was seriously wrong, and I watched as he excused himself from the donor group and stepped toward the two women with a questioning look that suggested he had not yet understood the magnitude of the crisis that was about to engulf him. Claire reached Julian first, and without any preamble or attempt to soften the blow, she held up the evidence packet so that he could see the cover sheet clearly, and she said in a voice that was loud enough to carry across the immediate area but not loud enough to disrupt the entire ballroom that she needed to speak with him immediately in private about a matter that concerned his professional conduct and his contract with the charity organization. Julian's face went pale as he apparently recognized what Claire was holding and understood that somehow his affair with Emma had been discovered and documented, and I watched as he looked around the room in what seemed like a desperate search for Emma, or perhaps for some exit route that would allow him to escape the confrontation that was about to take place. Margaret stepped closer to Julian and said something in a low voice that I could not hear from my position across the room, but whatever she said caused Julian to nod and follow both women out of the ballroom toward the corridor that led to the hotel's administrative offices and private meeting rooms. The entire interaction had taken less than 2 minutes, and most of the guests in the ballroom had not noticed anything unusual because they were focused on their own conversations and on the pre-event cocktail reception that was still in progress. But I saw that Emma had been watching from her position near the stage area, and that her expression had changed from confident anticipation to visible confusion and concern as she watched her lover being escorted out of the ballroom by his wife and his supervisor. I saw Emma pull out her phone and quickly type something, and I assumed she was sending a message to Julian asking what was happening and whether everything was all right, and I wondered how long it would take for her to understand that the crisis unfolding around Julian was also a crisis for her, and that within a matter of minutes she would be facing questions and consequences that she had apparently never imagined would result from her carefully managed affair. I remained in my position near the back of the ballroom and waited to see what would happen next, and after approximately 10 minutes, I saw Margaret Chen return to the ballroom alone, with an expression that suggested she had just dealt with a situation that had required her to make difficult decisions under intense time pressure. Margaret walked directly to the podium area where the evening's program materials were laid out, and she spoke briefly with the audiovisual technician who was managing the sound system and the projection screens that would be used during the formal presentation portion of the evening. I saw the technician nod and make some adjustments to his equipment, and then Margaret walked over to where Emma was standing and gestured for her to step aside into a quieter corner of the ballroom where they could have a private conversation. I watched Emma's body language change from confusion to alarm as Margaret spoke to her, and I saw Emma shake her head emphatically as if denying something that Margaret had just said, and then I saw Emma pull out her phone again and attempt to show Margaret something on the screen as if she was trying to provide evidence or explanation for whatever Margaret had just accused her of. Margaret looked at Emma's phone briefly and then shook her head and said something that caused Emma to take a step backward with an expression of shock and disbelief, And then Margaret reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out what I recognized as a copy of the evidence packet that I had prepared, and she handed it to Emma with a gesture that suggested she expected Emma to review the contents immediately and thoroughly. I watched as Emma opened the folder with trembling hands and began reading through the documents inside, and I saw her face transition through a series of emotions ranging from confusion to recognition to something that looked like pure panic, as she apparently understood that her affair with Julian had been comprehensively documented with evidence that she could not deny or explain away. Emma looked up from the folder and scanned the ballroom as if searching for someone, and when her eyes found me standing near the back of the room, I saw a flash of understanding cross her face as she realized that I was the source of the evidence packet, and that I had been aware of her affair for some time and had deliberately chosen to expose it at this particular moment in front of this particular audience. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom for what felt like an extended moment, but was probably only a few seconds, and I saw in Emma's expression a mixture of betrayal and anger and fear that told me she understood that her carefully constructed double life had just collapsed completely, and that there would be no way for her to salvage her reputation or her standing with the charity organization, or possibly even her marriage. Margaret said something else to Emma that I could not hear, and then Margaret walked away toward the podium area, leaving Emma standing alone near the wall, holding the evidence folder and looking like someone who had just received news of a death in the family. I watched as Emma remained frozen in that position for several seconds, and then she suddenly moved with purpose toward the ballroom exit, walking quickly but not quite running in a way that suggested she was trying to leave without drawing attention to herself, but was also desperate to escape the room before anyone could stop her or ask her questions. I considered following Emma to see where she was going and whether she was meeting Julian or simply leaving the hotel entirely, but I decided that allowing her space to process what had just happened was more strategic than forcing an immediate confrontation that would likely devolve into emotional accusations and denials. Instead, I walked over to where Margaret was now standing near the podium, reviewing notes for the evening's program, and I introduced myself as the hotel owner and asked if there was anything I could do to help manage the situation that had just unfolded. Margaret looked at me with an expression that combined professional courtesy with obvious distress, and she told me that she had just terminated Julian Vance's contract with the charity organization effective immediately for violation of the professional conduct standards that were clearly outlined in all vendor agreements, and that she had asked him to leave the hotel premises and to have no further contact with any volunteers or staff members associated with the gala or any other charity events. Margaret also told me that she had informed Emma that her services as a volunteer were no longer needed, and that the organization would be conducting an internal review of volunteer policies and oversight procedures to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. I thanked Margaret for handling the situation with such professionalism and discretion, and I told her that my hotel staff would provide whatever support was needed to ensure that the gala proceeded successfully despite the disruption caused by Julian's termination. Margaret nodded and said that she appreciated my cooperation and that she hoped the incident would not reflect poorly on my hotel's reputation, and I assured her that I understood that the situation had been caused by the poor judgment of individuals rather than any failure of the venue or the organization itself. Margaret then asked me directly whether I had been the one who had compiled and distributed the evidence of the affair, and I confirmed that yes, I had discovered the affair through my routine review of hotel records and credit card statements, and that I had felt obligated to inform the relevant parties once I had verified the facts through multiple independent sources. Margaret's expression softened slightly, as she apparently understood that my decision to expose the affair had not been motivated purely by personal vindictiveness, but rather by a legitimate concern about professional conduct and the appropriate use of charitable resources and volunteer relationships. She told me that while the timing had been unfortunate, given that the gala was scheduled to begin in less than 30 minutes, she believed that I had acted appropriately by bringing the information to her attention and allowing her to make decisions about how to address the situation before it became even more complicated or damaging to the organization's reputation. Margaret also told me that she had spoken briefly with Claire Vance after Julian had been escorted out of the hotel, and that Claire had indicated she would not be staying for the gala, but that she wanted Margaret to know that she supported the decision to terminate Julian's contract, and that she took full responsibility for having advocated for his hiring, despite concerns that some board members had raised about potential conflicts of interest. The gala proceeded on schedule despite the absence of its event coordinator and one of its key volunteer organizers, and I remained in the ballroom throughout the evening watching as the program unfolded and as donors made generous contributions to support the charity's mission and expressed appreciation for the elegant venue and the carefully planned presentations that highlighted the organization's work and impact. Several people asked me where Emma had gone and whether she was feeling all right, and I told them simply that she had needed to leave unexpectedly due to a personal emergency, and that I was sure she would have wanted to be there to see the successful conclusion of the event she had worked so hard to organize. I could see from the expressions of some guests that rumors were already beginning to circulate about what had happened between Margaret and Julian and Emma, but most people seemed content to focus on the charitable purpose of the evening and to avoid asking too many questions about interpersonal drama that was none of their business. Near the end of the formal program, Margaret took the stage to thank the various committees and volunteers who had contributed to making the gala a success, and I noticed that she conspicuously omitted any mention of Julian Vance or Emma Cross, despite the fact that both of them had been heavily involved in the planning and execution of the event. Several people in the audience seemed to notice these omissions and exchanged questioning glances, but no one asked for clarification, and Margaret moved smoothly through the rest of her remarks before inviting everyone to enjoy the remainder of the evening and to continue supporting the organization's important work in the community. As the formal program concluded and guests began moving toward the exits or gathering in small groups for continued conversation, I slipped out of the ballroom and returned to my office, where I could have some privacy to process the events of the evening and to prepare myself for whatever confrontation with Emma would inevitably follow once she had time to absorb the full implications of what had happened. I found Emma sitting in the hallway outside my office, with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up to her chest in a posture that suggested complete emotional collapse, and when she looked up at me as I approached, I saw that she had been crying and that her carefully applied makeup was streaked and smudged in a way that made her look both vulnerable and defeated. Emma asked me in a voice that was barely above a whisper why I had done this to her and why I had chosen to expose her affair in such a public and humiliating way instead of confronting her privately and giving her a chance to explain herself or to end the relationship with Julian on her own terms. I told Emma that I had not exposed her affair in a public way, but had simply provided factual documentation to a limited number of people who had legitimate professional and personal interests in knowing about the situation, and that if she was experiencing public humiliation, it was because of the choices she had made over the past 4 months, rather than because of any action I had taken. Emma told me that I had ruined her life and destroyed her reputation and taken away the one thing that had made her feel valued and important after years of feeling invisible and unappreciated in a marriage where Emma told me that I had ruined her life and destroyed her reputation and taken away the one thing that had made her feel valued and important after years of feeling invisible and unappreciated in a marriage where I was more interested in building my hotel business than in paying attention to her emotional needs or making her feel like she mattered as a person, rather than just as a wife who was expected to maintain the household and support my professional ambitions without complaint or recognition. I listened to Emma's accusations without interrupting because I wanted to understand whether she genuinely believed that her affair was somehow justified by perceived failures on my part, or whether she was simply trying to shift responsibility away from herself by constructing a narrative in which she was the victim of my emotional neglect rather than the perpetrator of a deliberate and sustained betrayal that had involved months of systematic lying and financial impropriety. When Emma finally stopped talking and looked at me with an expression that seemed to expect either an apology or at least some acknowledgement that I bore partial responsibility for driving her into Julian's arms, I told her that I understood she was upset and that I accepted that our marriage had perhaps not provided her with everything she needed emotionally, but that none of those legitimate grievances justified conducting an affair in my own hotel, using my own credit card, while lying to me repeatedly about where she was spending her time and who she was spending it with. I told Emma that if she had been unhappy in our marriage, she had countless opportunities to express those feelings directly to me through honest conversation, or through couples counseling, or through any number of other mechanisms that did not involve betraying my trust and exposing both of us to social and professional embarrassment. Emma responded by saying that I was oversimplifying a complex situation and that I had no understanding of how difficult it had been for her to try to communicate her needs to someone who was always focused on business problems and financial spreadsheets and property management issues rather than on the emotional temperature of his marriage. She said that she had tried numerous times over the years to tell me that she felt lonely and disconnected, and that she needed more quality time together and more genuine engagement with her interests and concerns, but that I had always responded by suggesting that she find a hobby or volunteer work or some other outside activity that would give her a sense of purpose without requiring me to change my own priorities or work schedule. Emma said that eventually she had stopped trying to get my attention because it was too painful to keep asking for something that I was apparently incapable of providing, and that when Julian had shown genuine interest in her ideas and had made her feel seen and appreciated as an intelligent and creative person, rather than just as a support system for my business operations, She had been unable to resist the validation and excitement that his attention offered. I asked Emma why she had not simply told me that she was considering having an affair, or that she had met someone who made her feel the things she claimed to have been missing in our marriage. And Emma looked at me as though I had asked the most absurd question imaginable, and she said that obviously she could not have told me about Julian because I would have immediately tried to stop her from seeing him, and would have used my knowledge of the situation to control her choices and monitor her activities in ways that would have made her feel even more trapped and suffocated than she already felt in our marriage. I pointed out to Emma that her reasoning revealed exactly the problem I had with her approach to the situation, which was that she had decided unilaterally that honesty was impossible, and that deception was therefore justified, rather than giving me any opportunity to respond to her concerns or to work with her on finding solutions that might have preserved our marriage while also addressing whatever legitimate needs were not being met. Emma told me that I was being naive if I thought that honest communication could have resolved the fundamental incompatibility that had developed between us over the years, and that the truth was that she had outgrown our marriage and had realized through her relationship with Julian that she was capable of having the kind of passionate and emotionally engaging partnership that she had always wanted but had never experienced with me. She said that Julian understood her in ways that I never had and never would, and that even though the affair had now been exposed and had cost her the volunteer position she had valued and would likely cost her other social and professional opportunities, she did not regret the time she had spent with him because it had shown her what was possible when two people genuinely connected on an emotional and intellectual level rather than just coexisting in a marriage of convenience and habit. I asked Emma whether she knew that Julian was married and that his wife Claire had also been devastated by the discovery of the affair, and Emma's expression shifted slightly as though this was a complication she had preferred not to think about too carefully. Emma told me that yes, she knew Julian was married, and that Julian had told her his marriage to Claire was essentially a professional arrangement that had stopped being romantic years ago, and that Claire was primarily focused on her career and her status within the charity organization rather than on their relationship as a couple. I told Emma that based on my conversation with Claire at the networking event several weeks ago, I had found her to be a thoughtful and dedicated person who clearly cared about both her work and her marriage, and that Julian's characterization of their relationship sounded suspiciously like the kind of self-serving story that people tell themselves when they want to justify betraying someone who trusts them. Emma became defensive and said that I had no right to judge her relationship with Julian or to make assumptions about what Julian's marriage was like based on a single conversation with his wife, and that the fact that I had apparently been investigating Julian and gathering information about his personal life proved that I was exactly the kind of controlling and suspicious person she had been trying to escape by pursuing a relationship with someone who trusted her and respected her autonomy. I responded by pointing out that I had not begun investigating anything until after I received the phone call from my front desk manager informing me that Emma had checked into my hotel with another man, and that everything I had learned subsequently had been the result of reviewing records that I had every legal and ethical right to access as a business owner and as a husband whose joint credit card was being used to pay for hotel rooms where his wife was conducting an affair. I also told Emma that her attempt to reframe my discovery of her affair as evidence of my controlling nature was a classic example of the kind of gaslighting and blame shifting that cheating spouses often engage in when they are caught and forced to face consequences for their behavior. Emma's face flushed red, and she told me that I had clearly been preparing for this confrontation and had probably been consulting with lawyers and planning exactly what to say to make her look like the villain while positioning myself as the innocent victim. And I confirmed that yes, I had consulted with my attorney and had documented everything carefully because I understood that Emma would likely try to construct an alternative narrative once she realized she could not simply deny the facts or talk her way out of the situation she had created. Emma stood up from her position against the wall and told me that she wanted to go home and collect some of her belongings and that she would be staying with a friend for the foreseeable future while she decided what to do about our marriage and her living situation. I told Emma that she was welcome to return to the house and take whatever personal items she needed, but that I would be changing the locks and the security codes within the next 48 hours, and that any future access to the property would need to be coordinated through our respective attorneys. Emma asked me whether I was seriously suggesting that she had no right to enter her own home without permission, and I told her that the house was jointly owned, but that given her pattern of deception and her stated desire to end our marriage, I thought it was prudent to establish clear boundaries and procedures rather than allowing a situation where she could come and go freely while I tried to process what had happened and make decisions about how to protect my interests. Emma told me that my talk about protecting my interests and establishing boundaries was just more evidence of how I viewed our marriage as a business transaction rather than as an emotional partnership, and that she pitied me for being so unable to access genuine human feelings that my first response to discovering my wife's affair was to start documenting evidence and consulting lawyers rather than experiencing the kind of raw, emotional devastation that a normal person would feel. I told Emma that I had experienced plenty of emotional devastation over the past week as I reviewed the evidence of her systematic deception and tried to understand how the person I had trusted completely for 12 years had been capable of lying to me so easily and so often, but that I had learned from my business experience that allowing emotions to drive major decisions was usually a recipe for poor outcomes, and that strategic thinking and careful planning were essential tools for navigating difficult situations. Emma shook her head and told me that I was proving her point with every word I spoke, and that the fact that I could stand there talking about strategic thinking and careful planning while discussing the end of our marriage showed exactly why she had needed to find emotional connection and validation outside of our relationship. She said that she was done trying to make me understand what she needed from a partner, and that she was going to collect her things from the house, and then she would communicate with me only through her attorney going forward, because it was clear that we had nothing more to say to each other that would be productive or meaningful. I told Emma that I thought communicating through attorneys was probably the most efficient approach given the circumstances, and that I would have my attorney Richard reach out to her attorney once she had retained counsel to begin the process of negotiating a separation agreement and eventually a divorce settlement. Emma looked at me with an expression that seemed to combine contempt and something that might have been sadness or regret, and she asked me whether I felt any satisfaction from having destroyed her reputation and humiliated her in front of the entire charitable community that she had been trying to build relationships with over the past year. I told Emma that I took no satisfaction from any aspect of this situation, but that I had made a decision to prioritize truth and accountability over social convenience, and that I believed the people who had been affected by her affair deserved to know the facts so they could make their own informed decisions about how to respond. I also told Emma that she had destroyed her own reputation through her choices and her actions, and that trying to blame me for the natural consequences of those choices was simply another form of the responsibility avoidance that had apparently characterized her approach to our marriage for longer than I had realized. Emma told me that I would regret taking such a hard line with her, and that when her attorney reviewed the evidence I had compiled and the methods I had used to gather that evidence, there would be serious questions about whether I had violated her privacy rights and whether my actions constituted a form of harassment or stalking that could be grounds for a restraining order. I told Emma that I welcomed any legal scrutiny of my actions because I was confident that I had operated within all applicable laws and had simply exercised my rights as a property owner and account holder to review records that were legitimately within my control, and that any judge who reviewed the evidence would understand that I had been careful to limit my investigation to legal sources of information and had not engaged in any hacking or wiretapping or other illegal surveillance methods. Emma did not respond to this statement, but instead turned and walked away down the corridor toward the hotel's main entrance, and I watched her leave while feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness because I understood that this conversation had likely marked the definitive end of our marriage and that whatever happened next would involve lawyers and mediators and formal legal proceedings rather than any possibility of reconciliation or repair. I returned to my office after Emma left the hotel and spent the next several hours sitting alone in the dim light from my desk lamp, trying to process the emotional weight of what had just transpired and what it meant for my future as a man whose entire adult identity had been built around the assumption that I was part of a stable marriage and a partnership that would endure whatever challenges life presented. I found myself replaying the conversation with Emma over and over in my mind, analyzing her words and her tone and her body language for clues about whether she had expressed any genuine remorse for what she had done, or whether her primary concern had been to justify her actions and deflect responsibility onto me for allegedly failing to meet her emotional needs. What I concluded after this extended period of reflection was that Emma had convinced herself through some combination of self-deception and rationalization that her affair with Julian had been a reasonable and even necessary response to deficiencies in our marriage, and that she had constructed a narrative in which she was the victim of my emotional unavailability rather than the perpetrator of a betrayal that had violated the fundamental trust on which any marriage must be built. I also found myself thinking about Julian and wondering what he was experiencing in the aftermath of his contract termination and his public exposure as someone who had violated professional ethics by pursuing a romantic relationship with a married volunteer who was effectively under his supervision in the context of the gala planning work. I imagined that Julian was probably dealing with his own version of the confrontation I had just had with Emma, except that his confrontation would be with his wife Claire, who had every right to feel doubly betrayed, both as a spouse whose trust had been violated and as a professional who had advocated for Julian's hiring, despite concerns about potential conflicts of interest. I wondered whether Julian would try to minimize his relationship with Emma and characterize it as a brief mistake or momentary lapse in judgment, or whether he would follow Emma's approach and try to blame his affair on deficiencies in his marriage to Claire that had allegedly driven him to seek validation and excitement elsewhere. The following morning, I woke early after a largely sleepless night and drove to the house that Emma and I had shared for the past 8 years, and I found that Emma had apparently been there during the night and had removed a significant quantity of her clothing and personal items, along with several pieces of furniture and decorative objects that she had presumably decided were more hers than ours, despite the fact that we had purchased most of them together using joint funds. I walked through the rooms of the house, noting what was missing, and feeling a strange sense of displacement as I realized that the physical space I had thought of as our home was already beginning to transform into something different. Something that reflected Emma's absence and the end of the shared life we had been building together for more than a decade. I made a list of the items Emma had taken so that I would have a record for the eventual property division negotiations, and I also took photographs of each room to document the state of the house at this point in time, in case there were later disputes about what had been removed and when. I spent the rest of that day making phone calls and sending messages to various people who needed to know about my changed circumstances, starting with my immediate family who had always liked Emma and who I knew would be shocked and disappointed to learn that our marriage was ending. My mother's reaction was particularly difficult because she had often told me over the years that I was lucky to have found someone as stable and trustworthy as Emma, and when I explained to her what had happened and how I had discovered Emma's affair, she initially seemed unable to process the information and kept asking whether there might have been some misunderstanding or some innocent explanation for the hotel visits and the credit card charges. I told my mother as gently as I could that there was no misunderstanding and no innocent explanation, and that I had extensive documentation proving that Emma had been conducting an affair for 4 months and had been lying systematically about her whereabouts and her activities during that entire period. My mother eventually accepted that the facts were as I had presented them, but she then shifted to asking whether I thought the marriage might be salvageable if Emma ended her relationship with Julian, and agreed to attend counseling and work on addressing whatever problems had led to the affair in the first place. I told my mother that while I appreciated her desire to see me remain in a stable marriage, I did not believe that rebuilding trust with someone who had demonstrated such a sustained capacity for deception would be possible or advisable, and that I had already consulted with my attorney about initiating formal separation proceedings that would eventually lead to divorce. My mother was quiet for a long moment after I said this, and then she told me that she supported whatever decision I made and that she was sorry I was going through such a painful experience, and that she would be available whenever I needed to talk or simply needed company during what she understood would be a difficult transition period. I also called my business partner Kenneth, who managed the day-to-day operations of 2 of my hotels and who had been asking me for several weeks whether everything was all right because he had noticed that I seemed distracted and less engaged than usual with various operational issues that normally would have commanded my full attention. I explained to Kenneth what had been happening in my personal life and why I had been preoccupied with gathering evidence and planning the exposure of Emma's affair, and Kenneth listened without interrupting and then told me that he had actually suspected something was wrong, because my behavior over the past few weeks had been uncharacteristic in ways that suggested I was dealing with a significant personal crisis. Kenneth told me that he would handle whatever additional responsibilities were necessary to keep the hotels running smoothly while I took time to deal with the legal and emotional aftermath of my separation from Emma. And he also offered to connect me with a colleague of his who had gone through a contested divorce several years earlier and who might be able to provide practical advice about managing the process. Over the next several days, I established a new routine that involved working from home most of the time rather than spending long hours at my hotel offices, partly because I wanted to maintain control over the house and its contents during the period before Emma and I formalized our separation agreement, and partly because I found that being in the hotel where Emma's affair had physically taken place was emotionally exhausting in ways that I had not anticipated. I met with my attorney Richard twice during that first week to review the evidence I had compiled and to discuss strategy for the separation negotiations that would formally begin once Emma retained her own counsel. And Richard told me that based on the documentation I had gathered, I was in an extremely strong position to negotiate favorable terms for property division and to avoid paying any spousal support, given that Emma's affair and her misuse of joint financial resources for personal purposes would likely be viewed unfavorably by any judge or mediator who reviewed the case. Richard also advised me to prepare for the possibility that Emma's attorney might try to argue that my method of discovering and documenting the affair had violated Emma's privacy rights or had constituted a form of emotional abuse through surveillance and monitoring, and he suggested that I prepare a detailed timeline showing that I had not engaged in any surveillance until after I had received the phone call from my front desk manager alerting me to Emma's presence at the hotel with another man. Richard explained that the key legal distinction was between proactive monitoring of a spouse's activities without any reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing, which could potentially be characterized as controlling or abusive behavior, and reactive investigation following a specific incident that provided legitimate grounds for concern, which was generally considered a reasonable exercise of a person's right to gather information about matters that directly affected their interests and well-being. I followed Richard's advice and spent several hours preparing a comprehensive memorandum that documented the exact sequence of events leading to my discovery of Emma's affair, starting with the phone call from Patricia at 2:47 on the Thursday afternoon and continuing through each step of my investigation, including the review of hotel records, the examination of credit card statements, the analysis of security camera footage, and the verification of Emma's false alibis through my conversation with the charity organization's administrative staff. I made sure to emphasize in my memorandum that each investigative step had been prompted by specific evidence or inconsistencies that emerged from the previous step, and that I had at all times limited my investigation to sources of information that I had legal authority to access either as a property owner or as a joint account holder or as a spouse with legitimate concerns about my partner's fidelity and truthfulness. During this same period, I also began receiving communications from various people in Emma's social and professional networks who had heard about the exposure of her affair at the charity gala and who were reaching out either to express sympathy for what I was going through or to ask for details about what had actually happened because the rumors circulating through the community varied widely in their specifics and their characterization of who was at fault. I responded to most of these communications with brief and factual statements confirming that Emma had been having an affair with the gala's event coordinator and that the relationship had been discovered and documented through my review of hotel records and credit card statements, and I made clear that I did not want to engage in extended discussions about the emotional dimensions of the situation or about Emma's motivations or about whether I thought the marriage might be salvageable despite what had happened. I did receive one particularly significant communication during that first week that forced me to reconsider some of my assumptions about the timeline and the dynamics of Emma's affair with Julian, and this communication came from a woman named Andrea Morrison, who identified herself as a former volunteer with the charity organization, and who said she had information about Julian's pattern of behavior with female volunteers that I might find relevant to understanding what had happened. I agreed to meet with Andrea at a coffee shop near my house, and when we sat down together, she told me that she had volunteered with the charity for approximately 3 years before resigning her position about 6 months ago, and that her resignation had been prompted in part by her discovery that Julian had been pursuing inappropriate relationships with multiple married volunteers over the course of his 2-year association with the organization. Andrea told me that she had personally witnessed Julian using the same pattern with at least 2 other women before Emma, where he would identify volunteers who seemed professionally frustrated or emotionally vulnerable and would offer them special attention and recognition for their contributions, while gradually escalating the relationship from professional collaboration to personal friendship to romantic involvement. Andrea said that she had tried to bring her concerns about Julian's behavior to the attention of the organization's leadership, including Claire Vance, but that her complaints had been dismissed as gossip or professional jealousy, and that she had eventually concluded that the organization was more interested in protecting Julian's reputation and maintaining his services as an event coordinator than in addressing legitimate concerns about his exploitation of the volunteer program for personal purposes. I asked Andrea why she was coming forward now with this information, rather than at some earlier point, when it might have prevented Emma from becoming involved with Julian, and Andrea told me that she had not known about Emma's specific situation until she heard about the exposure at the gala, and that she was reaching out now because she wanted me to understand that Emma was not the only victim of Julian's predatory pattern, and that there were likely other women who had been manipulated in similar ways but who had not been caught or exposed. Andrea also told me that she believed Claire Vance had been aware of at least some of Julian's previous inappropriate relationships, but had chosen to ignore the warning signs because acknowledging them would have required her to confront difficult questions about her own judgment in advocating for Julian's hiring and about the organizational culture that had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. This information from Andrea forced me to reconsider some of my initial assumptions about Emma's affair and her level of responsibility for what had happened, because if Julian had indeed been using a calculated pattern to identify and manipulate vulnerable volunteers, then Emma's involvement with him might have been less a matter of her actively choosing to betray our marriage and more a matter of her being targeted and exploited. This information from Andrea forced me to reconsider some of my initial assumptions about Emma's affair and her level of responsibility for what had happened, because if Julian had indeed been using a calculated pattern to identify and manipulate vulnerable volunteers, then Emma's involvement with him might have been less a matter of her actively choosing to betray our marriage, and more a matter of her being targeted and exploited by someone who had refined his approach through multiple previous attempts with other women in similar circumstances. However, even as I considered this more charitable interpretation of Emma's behavior, I found that I could not completely absolve her of responsibility, because regardless of how skillfully Julian might have manipulated her emotions and her sense of self-worth, Emma had still made dozens of specific choices over a 4-month period to lie to me about her whereabouts, to use our joint credit card to pay for hotel rooms where she met her lover, and to maintain an elaborate system of deception that required constant attention and adjustment to prevent discovery. I asked Andrea whether she would be willing to provide a written statement documenting what she knew about Julian's pattern of behavior with volunteers, and whether she would be willing to share that information with Claire Vance or with the charity organization's board of directors so that they could conduct a more thorough investigation of how Julian had been allowed to continue working with vulnerable volunteers despite multiple warning signs and complaints. Andrea told me that she would consider providing such a statement, but that she was concerned about potential retaliation or defamation claims from Julian if she went on record with allegations about his conduct, and she said that she would need to consult with her own attorney before making any formal statements that might expose her to legal liability. I told Andrea that I understood her concerns and that I would be willing to cover her legal consultation fees if that would help her feel more comfortable about coming forward with information that could prevent other women from being victimized by Julian's pattern in the future. Andrea thanked me for the offer and said she would think about it, and then she asked me how I was coping emotionally with the aftermath of Emma's affair, and whether I had considered the possibility that Emma might genuinely have been manipulated and confused rather than deliberately malicious in her decision to become involved with Julian. I told Andrea that I had been wrestling with exactly that question for the past week, and that I honestly did not know whether understanding Emma's affair as the result of Julian's manipulation would make me feel better or worse about the situation. Because on one hand, it would mean that Emma had been victimized by someone who exploited her vulnerabilities, but on the other hand, it would also mean that Emma had been so emotionally disconnected from our marriage that she had been unable to recognize or resist obvious manipulation tactics that she presumably would have seen through if she had been in a healthier psychological state. Andrea nodded and said that she thought my analysis was perceptive and that in her experience, most affairs involve some combination of individual agency and external manipulation, and that trying to assign precise percentages of blame to the various parties involved was usually less productive than simply accepting that the situation had been complex and that multiple people had made poor choices that had resulted in significant harm. Andrea also told me that based on her observations of the 2 other women who had been involved with Julian before Emma, she believed that the affairs tended to burn out relatively quickly once the initial excitement wore off, and once the practical complications of maintaining secret relationships became too burdensome, and that in both cases the women had eventually ended their relationships with Julian and had tried to quietly distance themselves from the charity organization to avoid ongoing awkwardness and social judgment. I thanked Andrea for sharing her perspective and for reaching out to provide context that I would not have had access to otherwise, and I told her that regardless of what I ultimately decided about my marriage to Emma, I appreciated knowing that she had not been the first person to fall victim to Julian's pattern, and that there was at least some evidence suggesting that Julian bore significant responsibility for creating situations in which married volunteers became emotionally entangled with him in ways that damaged their primary relationships and their reputations. After Andrea left the coffee shop, I sat alone for another hour thinking about what she had told me and trying to decide whether this new information should change my approach to the separation negotiations with Emma, or my feelings about whether our marriage might be salvageable if we both committed to intensive counseling and honest communication about what had gone wrong. What I eventually concluded was that while Andrea's information provided useful context and helped me understand that Emma had been targeted by someone with a practice pattern of manipulation, this understanding did not fundamentally change the fact that Emma had chosen repeatedly over a 4-month period to continue her relationship with Julian even after she must have recognized that what she was doing was wrong and was causing harm to our marriage. I realized that if Emma had come to me after the first or even the second encounter with Julian and had told me that she had made a mistake and had been manipulated into a situation that she now regretted, I might have been able to forgive her and work with her to repair the damage and strengthen our marriage against future vulnerabilities. But the fact that Emma had sustained the affair for 4 months and had lied to me consistently throughout that entire period suggested a level of commitment to the deception that went beyond simple manipulation or temporary confusion, and that indicated deeper problems in her character or in our relationship that I did not believe could be resolved through counseling or good intentions alone. I received a call from my attorney Richard 3 days after my conversation with Andrea, and Richard told me that he had been contacted by an attorney named Susan Brennan, who was now representing Emma in the separation proceedings, and that Susan had sent over a preliminary list of demands and concerns that Emma wanted addressed as we moved toward formalizing our separation agreement. Richard said that Emma's list included several items that he considered unreasonable or legally unsupportable, including a demand that I provide her with exclusive access to our jointly owned house for a period of at least 6 months while she decided whether she wanted to remain in the area or relocate to a different city, and a demand that I agree not to discuss the circumstances of our separation with anyone beyond my immediate family and legal counsel, because Emma claimed that my distribution of the evidence packet at the charity gala had constituted a form of defamation that had damaged her reputation and her professional prospects. Richard told me that he had responded to Susan's letter by pointing out that Emma had no legal basis for demanding exclusive access to jointly owned property, and no legal basis for restricting my speech about factual matters that were documented through records and evidence that I had obtained legally. Richard also said that he had included in his response letter a copy of the comprehensive evidence file I had compiled showing the pattern of Emma's affair over 4 months and the systematic deception she had engaged in to conceal her activities. And he had suggested that if Emma wanted to avoid protracted litigation that might result in additional public exposure of her affair, she should consider agreeing to a separation agreement that involved a straightforward division of jointly owned assets with no spousal support payments in either direction and no restrictions on either party's ability to discuss factual matters related to the separation. I asked Richard whether he thought Emma would accept such terms, or whether she was likely to push for a more favorable settlement based on claims that I had been emotionally distant or had contributed to the breakdown of the marriage through my focus on business rather than on our relationship. Richard told me that based on his experience with similar cases, he believed Emma's attorney would ultimately advise her to accept reasonable terms, rather than risk going to trial where the evidence of her affair and her misuse of joint funds would be presented in detail and would likely result in an outcome that was no more favorable and possibly less favorable than what we were offering in the separation agreement. Richard also told me that Emma's claim about defamation was legally weak because truth was an absolute defense against defamation claims, and because I had limited my distribution of the evidence to people who had legitimate professional or personal interests in knowing about the affair. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma and I communicated exclusively through our attorneys as they negotiated the specific terms of our separation agreement. And during that time, I continued to live in our house, while Emma stayed with her friend whose identity she had never disclosed to me, and whose support she apparently valued more highly than any possibility of reconciliation with her husband. I found that living alone in the house that had been our shared home for 8 years was simultaneously liberating and depressing, because on one hand, I appreciated the freedom to establish my own routines, and to make decisions about how to spend my time without having to coordinate with Emma or accommodate her schedule and preferences. But on the other hand, I was constantly reminded of her absence by the empty spaces where her belongings had been, and by the silence that filled rooms that had previously been animated by her presence and her voice. I also found myself thinking frequently about Julian and wondering what had happened to him in the aftermath of his contract termination and the exposure of his pattern of inappropriate relationships with married volunteers, and eventually my curiosity prompted me to do some additional research into his current circumstances and professional status. What I discovered through searches of professional networking sites and charity organization websites was that Julian appeared to have left the city entirely and had relocated to a different state where he was apparently attempting to rebuild his career in event coordination without the baggage of his reputation in our local community. I found no evidence that Claire had remained with him or had followed him to his new location, which suggested that their marriage had not survived the exposure of his affair any more successfully than my marriage to Emma was surviving the same revelation. I also learned through continued conversations with people in the charity sector that the organization where Emma had been volunteering had initiated a comprehensive review of its volunteer policies and oversight procedures in response to the revelation about Julian's pattern of behavior, and that several other women had come forward after the gala to report their own uncomfortable interactions with Julian that had not risen to the level of full affairs, but had involved inappropriate comments or boundary violations that had made them feel uncomfortable continuing their volunteer work. This information confirmed what Andrea had told me about Julian's predatory pattern, and it also made me feel some degree of vindication about my decision to expose the affair publicly, rather than handling it as a private matter between Emma and myself, because the exposure had apparently created an opportunity for other women to share their experiences, and for the organization to address systemic problems that had been allowed to persist because no one had been willing to challenge Julian's behavior or to question his relationship with the volunteers he worked with. During this same period, I also began attending individual therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in helping people process the emotional aftermath of infidelity and relationship betrayal, and I found that having a structured space to talk about my feelings and my reactions to what had happened was more valuable than I had anticipated. My therapist helped me understand that my tendency to respond to Emma's betrayal through investigation and documentation rather than through emotional expression was not necessarily unhealthy or avoidant, but rather reflected my particular way of processing difficult experiences and asserting control over situations that felt chaotic and overwhelming. My therapist also helped me recognize that my anger toward Emma was legitimate and justified, but that holding on to that anger indefinitely would ultimately be more harmful to me than to her, and that at some point I would need to find a way to accept what had happened and to release the emotional charge associated with her betrayal so that I could move forward with my life without being permanently defined by this experience. The separation agreement was finally finalized in early December after nearly 6 weeks of negotiations between our respective attorneys, and the terms reflected what Richard had predicted would be the most likely outcome given the strength of the evidence I had compiled and Emma's weak position as the party who had clearly violated the implicit and explicit terms of our marriage contract through her sustained pattern of deception and infidelity. Under the terms of the agreement, Emma would receive her equitable share of the appreciation in value of our jointly owned house, but would have no claim to any of my hotel properties or business interests, because those had been established before our marriage and had been maintained as separate property through careful legal structuring that Richard had helped me implement years earlier. The agreement also specified that neither party would pay spousal support to the other, which represented a significant victory for my position given that Emma had initially demanded temporary support to help her transition to independent living while she looked for employment to replace the volunteer work that had consumed so much of her time over the past year. The agreement included a mutual non-disparagement clause that prohibited both Emma and me from making false or defamatory statements about each other to third parties, but it explicitly preserved my right to discuss factual matters related to the affair and the circumstances of our separation as long as I limited such discussions to truthful statements supported by documentary evidence. Emma had fought hard to include stronger confidentiality provisions that would have prevented me from discussing the affair at all, but Richard had successfully argued that such provisions would be unenforceable as prior restraints on speech, and that Emma had no legitimate privacy interest in concealing facts about her conduct that had already been disclosed to multiple parties and that had become matters of public knowledge within our social and professional communities. The final version of the agreement also included provisions addressing the division of personal property and household items, and Emma and I agreed to coordinate through our attorneys to arrange times when she could return to the house to collect her remaining belongings, without requiring us to be present in the same space at the same time. I signed the separation agreement on a cold Thursday morning in Richard's office with a sense of finality and relief that surprised me given how much emotional turmoil I had experienced over the previous 2 months. And Richard told me that he would file the necessary paperwork with the court to convert our separation into a formal divorce after the mandatory waiting period had elapsed. Richard also told me that he had heard through his professional network that Emma had accepted a position with a marketing firm in a city about 200 miles away, and that she was apparently planning to relocate permanently and to start over in a place where her reputation had not been damaged by the exposure of her affair, and where she would not have to face constant reminders of what she had lost through her poor choices and her systematic deception. I told Richard that I thought Emma's decision to relocate was probably wise from her perspective, even if it meant abandoning the social and professional network she had spent years building in our community. And I found that I felt no particular sadness about the prospect of Emma leaving the area and removing herself from my daily life in a more complete and permanent way. After the separation agreement was finalized, I made a conscious decision to focus my energy and attention on rebuilding my life and establishing new routines that would allow me to move forward without constantly dwelling on the betrayal I had experienced or the marriage I had lost. I threw myself back into my hotel business with renewed intensity and began working on plans to acquire the 5th property I had been considering before Emma's affair had disrupted my ability to focus on strategic business decisions, and I found that having concrete professional goals and challenges to work toward was therapeutic in ways that simply sitting alone in my house processing my emotions could never have been. I also began making more effort to maintain and strengthen my relationships with family members and friends who had supported me through the crisis, and I accepted invitations to social gatherings and events that I might previously have declined because I was too busy with work or because Emma and I had other commitments that took precedence. One evening in mid-December, I received an unexpected phone call from Claire Vance, who identified herself and then asked if I would be willing to meet with her for coffee because she had some things she wanted to discuss with me related to our shared experience of being betrayed by our respective spouses and the aftermath of the exposure at the charity gala. I agreed to meet with Claire despite feeling some trepidation about what such a conversation might entail, and 2 days later we sat across from each other in a quiet corner of the same coffee shop where I had met with Andrea Morrison several weeks earlier. Claire looked tired and sad in a way that suggested she had not been sleeping well, and she told me that she wanted to thank me for having the courage to expose Julian's affair even though doing so had caused her significant pain and embarrassment, because she believed that learning the truth had ultimately been better than continuing to live in ignorance while her husband exploited his position and manipulated vulnerable women. Claire told me that she and Julian had separated immediately after the gala and that she had filed for divorce based on irreconcilable differences and Julian's violation of the trust that was essential to any healthy marriage. She said that Julian had initially tried to minimize his relationship with Emma and had characterized it as a brief mistake that had gotten out of hand, but that once Claire had reviewed the evidence packet I had prepared and had spoken with other women who had come forward with their own stories about Julian's inappropriate behavior, she had realized that her husband had been conducting a pattern of manipulation and exploitation that extended far beyond his relationship with Emma, and that suggested deep character flaws that she had somehow failed to recognize or acknowledge during their years together. Claire said that she felt angry at herself for having been so blind to Julian's true nature and for having defended him against complaints and concerns that other people had raised, and she said that she was now working with a therapist to understand why she had been so invested in maintaining an image of her marriage as successful and her husband as trustworthy when there had been numerous warning signs that should have prompted her to ask harder questions and demand better accountability. I told Claire that I understood exactly what she was describing because I had been engaged in a similar process of self-examination, trying to understand how I had failed to notice the signs of Emma's affair and why I had been so willing to accept her explanations and alibis without subjecting them to the kind of critical scrutiny that I routinely applied to business matters and professional relationships. Claire nodded and said that she thought both of us had been victims of a psychological phenomenon where people tend to see what they expect to see and tend to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm their existing beliefs and assumptions rather than in ways that challenge those beliefs and force uncomfortable realizations. She said that in her case, she had wanted so badly to believe that her marriage was strong and that Julian was faithful that she had unconsciously filtered out information that contradicted that desired narrative, and she suspected that I had engaged in a similar process of selective attention that had allowed Emma's deception to continue for 4 months before circumstances forced me to confront reality. Claire also told me that she had learned from conversations with the charity organization's board members that there had been at least 2 previous instances where volunteers or staff members had raised concerns about Julian's boundary violations and inappropriate comments, but that those concerns had been dismissed or downplayed because Julian was considered valuable to the organization and because the complainants had been reluctant to press their cases in the face of institutional resistance. Claire said that she felt some responsibility for having created an organizational culture where Julian's behavior had been tolerated and where women who tried to report problems had been made to feel as though they were overreacting or misinterpreting innocent interactions. And she told me that she had submitted her resignation as program director to the charity's board because she did not believe she could continue in a leadership role given her failure to protect the volunteers who had been under her supervision and who had trusted her to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. I told Claire that while I understood her feelings of responsibility, I thought she was being too hard on herself, and that the primary blame for what had happened belonged to Julian, who had deliberately and systematically exploited his position and manipulated women who were vulnerable to his tactics. I also told Claire that her decision to resign from her position struck me as an overreaction that would deprive the charity organization of experienced leadership at a time when they needed someone who understood the mistakes that had been made and who could help implement better policies and oversight procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. Claire listened to what I was saying and then told me that she appreciated my perspective, but that she had already made her decision and felt that stepping away from the organization was necessary, both for her own healing process and to demonstrate to the board and to the volunteers that she took accountability seriously and understood that leaders must face consequences when they fail in their responsibilities. We talked for nearly 2 hours that evening, covering topics ranging from the specific details of our respective separation and divorce proceedings to broader questions about trust and betrayal, and whether people who had been deceived by their partners could ever fully recover their ability to trust future partners in new relationships. Claire told me that her therapist had assured her that healing was possible and that many people who experienced infidelity and betrayal were eventually able to form new relationships that were healthier and more honest than their previous marriages, but that the process required significant time and emotional work and a willingness to confront painful truths about one's own contributions to relationship dynamics that had enabled or facilitated the betrayal. I told Claire that my own therapist had said something similar and that I was trying to remain open to the possibility that this painful experience might ultimately lead to personal growth and better self-understanding, even if that felt like cold comfort in the immediate aftermath of having my marriage destroyed. As our conversation was winding down, Claire asked me whether I had heard anything about how Emma was doing or whether she had expressed any remorse or attempted to apologize for the harm she had caused. And I told Claire that I had received one brief email from Emma a few days after we signed the separation agreement in which she had said that she was sorry for the pain she had caused me and that she hoped I would eventually be able to forgive her and to remember the good years we had shared before everything fell apart. I told Claire that I had not responded to Emma's email because I was not yet ready to engage in that kind of emotional processing, and because I suspected that Emma's apology was motivated more by her desire to feel less guilty about what she had done than by any genuine understanding of the impact her betrayal had had on my life and my sense of self. Claire nodded and said that she had received a similar communication from Julian in which he had tried to apologize while simultaneously suggesting that problems in their marriage had contributed to his decision to seek validation elsewhere, and that she had responded by telling him that she was not interested in his attempts to justify his behavior or to shift partial responsibility onto her for his choices. Before we parted that evening, Claire told me that she had found our conversation helpful and that she appreciated having the opportunity to talk with someone who truly understood what she was experiencing because he had been through a parallel situation. And she asked whether I would be open to meeting again in the future for coffee or dinner as friends who shared the bond of having survived betrayal by their partners. I told Claire that I would be happy to meet with her again, and that I had also found our conversation valuable, and we exchanged contact information and agreed to stay in touch as we both navigated the challenging process of rebuilding our lives after the collapse of our marriages. As I drove home that night, I found myself thinking about the strange way that Emma's affair had created an unexpected connection between Claire and myself, and I wondered whether this connection might eventually develop into something more than friendship. The divorce was finalized 3 months later on a gray March morning when Richard called to tell me the judge had signed the final decree and that I was now legally single for the first time in 12 years. I felt neither celebration nor grief at the news, only a quiet recognition that a chapter of my life had closed and that whatever came next would be built on the foundation of hard-won wisdom about trust and deception and the importance of paying attention to evidence rather than to comfortable assumptions about the people we believe we know.